Thank you for watching Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Putnam. I am thankful to all news resources. Following are the news which have been reported by American, European and Canadian channels. African, Asian channels and all news agencies have reported the same news. Now the news in detail. A deadliest terrorist attack in Russia in decades. Immigrant workers playing an important part in farming economy in Western America. A surge of migrants in a small Wisconsin town. Russian president vowed to take revenge of the terrorist attack. He blamed mostly on Ukraine. Mr. Biden signed the $1.2 trillion spending bill for avoiding the shutdown. Israel does not allow food to come into Gaza. UN Secretary General blamed Israel for famine. Russian spacecraft took off for the International Space Station. Bauer Children's series author died. Canada paid tribute to his former Prime Minister. Kate Middleton getting enormous response from the public after disclosing his cancer disease. Now the news in detail.
Tonight on PBS News Weekend, terror in Moscow. The deadliest massacre in decades leaves Russia on edge just days after President Vladimir Putin was re-elected.
They were just walking and shooting as they went along. There were 5 or 6 of them. They were just walking and gunning down everyone methodically in silence.
Then the working conditions for migrant farm workers and the role they play in U.S. economic growth. And how the residents of a small Wisconsin town are dealing with a surge in migrants.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions and friends of the News Hour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm John Yang. Russian President Vladimir Putin has vowed to punish those responsible for the terror attack on a suburban Moscow concert hall that killed at least 133 people and, according to Russian officials, left about 145 more wounded. It was one of the worst acts of terror in Russia in decades. Throughout Russia tonight, security has been beefed up, and in Moscow, people are remembering the dead and offering help to the wounded. Hundreds of people lined up in the rain this morning in Moscow to donate blood and plasma, giving what they can for the wounded from last night's carnage.
Of course, I was shocked and felt fear and horror. I've been to a concert at Crocus myself, and when I saw those horrible videos, I was shocked and in tears, even now when I speak about it. It was very scary to see it all.
A branch of the Islamic State based in Afghanistan claimed responsibility for the attack. It began with gunmen storming the hall, firing point blank at people who had gathered for a rock concert. Dave Primoff was among the crowd.
The shots were not sporadic. There were constant volleys of gunfire. We all got up and tried to move closer to the aisles. People began to panic, started to run, and collided with each other. Some fell down and others trampled on them.
Witnesses said the attackers threw explosive devices that started a fire. This morning, a smoldering ruin was all that was left after the roof collapsed. Investigators combed through wreckage looking for bodies and evidence. In an address to the nation, Russian President Vladimir Putin said all the gunmen had been arrested. He never mentioned the ISIS claim of responsibility, instead linking Ukraine to the attack.
Now the main thing is to not let those behind this bloodbath commit new crimes. All 4 of the actual performers of the act of terror, all those who shot and killed people, were found and detained. They tried to hide and were moving in the direction of Ukraine. There, according to preliminary data, they had a crossing of the border prepared from the Ukrainian side.
Putin provided no evidence to support his claim, and Kyiv denied any involvement. U.S. intelligence said they had warned Russian officials of a planned ISIS attack in Moscow. Outside the ruins of the concert hall today, people left flowers at a makeshift memorial. Among them, concert-goer Anastasia Rodionova, who says she feels lucky to be alive.
They were just walking and shooting as they went along, gunning down everyone methodically in silence. You understand only now that you are lucky, really lucky. I came home, my coat was just covered in blood. Apparently someone shielded me.
Putin declared tomorrow a national day of mourning as the search goes on for answers about the brutal attack. Journalist Michael Weiss is the editor of The Insider, an independent news outlet covering Russia. He's also co-author of ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror. Michael, what do we know about ISIS-K, this branch of ISIS that's claimed responsibility?
So ISIS-K is established in Afghanistan, and they are ranged against a host of other jihadi actors, including the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and they've been angling to hit Russia for quite a while. If you look at their communiques and their propaganda, they revile Vladimir Putin, one of the reasons being that Russia maintains a partnership with the Taliban, their sworn enemy. The United States has fairly good intelligence on their capability and their motivation, because we occupied Afghanistan for more than 20 years, and clearly our departure has not really interfered with the ability to collect signals intelligence, which is what I believe the United States passed along to Moscow a little less than a month ago. On March 7th, you'll recall the U.S. Embassy put out a notice advising people to stay away from public events for the next 48 hours, and that indeed, according to reporting, was tied to a credible ISIS-K threat planned for Russia.
And according to reporting, they also passed along that information to the Russians. Why did Russian security miss this?
Well, we don't know that they did. I mean, it's always possible that some guys can slip through, or that the intelligence was not specific enough to identify the time, place, and the kind of culprits that would be behind it. But look, I mean, it's no mystery that Russia's security and military resources are predominantly poured into the war conquest in Ukraine, and also at the domestic level, there's a huge crackdown on dissent. People arrested at Alexei Navalny's funeral a few weeks ago. They're cracking down on any kind of anti-war demonstrations or protests. You know, if you so much as post a news article from the New York Times about Russian casualties in Ukraine, you could be thrown in jail for several years. So what we're seeing emerge in Russia is a kind of neo-totalitarian state. And under those conditions, the idea that the perfidious Americans are claiming that ISIS-K or some Islamist group is trying to attack Russia, you can imagine the paranoia at the level of the Kremlin, that they probably wouldn't credit that as plausible. They would see it as some kind of psychological operation. And I mean, indeed, President Putin came out today and sort of pointed the finger at Ukraine, even though it is highly implausible that Ukraine had anything to do with this whatsoever.
Not only pointed the finger at Ukraine, he didn't mention the ISIS claim of responsibility at all. What do you think is going on with that?
Well, it's embarrassing to Putin, right? I mean, the kind of leitmotif of his reign, at least in the first decade and a half, was to reconstitute Fortress Russia, to make Russia this kind of impenetrable security state, which had all but withered away with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin himself, famously former lieutenant colonel in the KGB, the KGB was colloquially known as the sword and the shield, right? It was there to protect the state and the sanctity of the state. So for him, he's got a lot of egg on his face right now, because this wasn't just a kind of a terror attack where some lone wolf drove a car into a crowd. This was highly sophisticated. This had been planned for months, if you take ISIS at their word. The Russian security services claim to have detained 4 of the assailants, and this was a machine gun fire into a crowded mall and concert venue, but also a fire set to burn the whole place down, which it looks very much like they succeeded in that respect. And now we're talking about over 100 people dead and many more wounded. So this is going to be a trauma in Russia. And so Putin, I think, as is his wont, is trying to deflect blame away from himself, to point the finger at mysterious dark forces that are arrayed against Russia. The question is, are the Russian people going to buy it this time?
And would you expect Putin to use this as sort of as a pretense in the war with Ukraine?
Well, that's one of the fears, yeah. I mean, if he's saying that, the long, dark arm of the Ukrainian intelligence services, and of course behind them, keep in mind, he always blames the United States. He thinks of Ukraine as a vassal, not with no agency or sovereignty of its own. But if he's pointing the finger at Ukraine, suggesting that, these jihadis were making their way for the Russian-Ukrainian border, not a very clever exit strategy for anybody who's just carried out an attack like that, by the way, one could then hypothesize he's using that as a pretext to escalate. Now, Russia has begun to refer to this operation in Ukraine, which is a war, as a war. It's no longer just a special military operation. There's been all kinds of rumors and reporting in the Russian press about possible mobilization campaign, meaning a huge call-up, not a partial mobilization like before, possibly another attempted attack to conquer Kharkiv in northeast Ukraine, a city that had been one of the main targets in February of 2022. So we don't know. And as you can imagine, because of this, it's led to any number of conspiracy theories. I've seen many Ukrainians suggest that the Russians themselves may have planned this as a false flag attack akin to the Moscow apartment bombings. Ukrainian military intelligence suggested as much. In this case, I have to be honest. I mean, I've spent a long time studying ISIS and their tactics and their motives, and it certainly seems to me like what you see is what you get here. ISIS-K looking to attack Russia and succeeding in a spectacular fashion.
Michael Weiss, editor of The Insider. Thank you very much.
Sure, anytime.
President Biden signed a $1.2 trillion spending bill to fund more than half the federal government through the end of the current budget year on September 30th. Final passage came in the Senate at about 2 a.m., averting a partial government shutdown. The measure includes a pay raise for the military and increased border security spending. Not included, aid for either Israel or Ukraine. Lawmakers are expected to take up those 2 items in early April after a 2-week recess. Egypt says about 7,000 aid trucks are being denied entry into Gaza as the United Nations warns of imminent famine. On the Egyptian side of the Rafah border crossing, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said blocking the aid deliveries is a moral outrage. He said it was time to truly flood Gaza with aid, as he put it, and called for an immediate ceasefire. A Russian spacecraft blasted off from Kazakhstan today, taking a crew of 3 to the International Space Station for a 6-month stay. Teams made up of an American, a Russian, and a Belarusian. It's one of the last remaining collaborations between Russia and the West. And Laurent de Brunhoff has died. He was the author and illustrator of the beloved children's series Babar the Elephant. He'd been in hospice care for several weeks. Babar was the creation of his father, Jean de Brunhoff. After he died, Laurent nurtured his creation and, as his father did, provided the illustrations of the Elephant King of Celestville. It grew into a global franchise. De Brunhoff was 98 years old. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, the living and working conditions for migrant workers on dairy farms, and how a small Wisconsin town is dealing with the recent surge of migrants.
This is PBS News Weekend from WETA Studios in Washington, home of the PBS NewsHour, weeknights on PBS.
Advocates of legal immigration say foreign-born workers have long been a key factor in U.S. economic growth, and researchers say they've been crucial to the jobs recovery after the pandemic. But are immigrant workers sharing in the benefits of their contributions? For more than a year, ProPublica has been looking into the harsh realities of life for immigrant workers on Midwest dairy farms. Melissa Sanchez is a ProPublica reporter. She focuses on immigrants and low-wage workers. Melissa, over this several months of working on this story, what are the biggest takeaways that you came out of this reporting with?
Sure. A few of them are just how dangerous the work is. I wasn't aware of it, but workers are routinely injured, and it's almost a normalized thing. Like, workers say that if you haven't been hurt on a farm, then you really haven't worked on one before. So the danger is one thing, and then also the lack of regulation. Like, even though it's very dangerous, dairy work is less regulated than other kinds of work for a number of reasons, but particularly workers on small farms have fewer protections. And then the immigrant nature of the work. Almost everybody that I've met is an undocumented immigrant from Central America or Mexico who's on these farms.
These farms are less regulated than other agricultural operations. Why is that?
So it's basically a technicality. The way the laws are written, some of the farm worker protection laws that we have, they apply only to work that's seasonal or temporary, and cows are milked year-round. And that distinction sort of leaves this class of workers out. But we know that farm workers are sort of exempt from a lot of other labor laws and protections, including overtime pay, for example. And workers' comp laws often don't cover small farms, and a lot of these folks work on small farms. There's just like one after another of laws that leaves these people out.
Tell us what sort of an average day is like for these workers.
The days are pretty wild. One thing to know is that workers work 60 to 80 hours a week, kind of on a regular basis, and the shifts are scattered. They might start a shift from 4 a.m. to 10 a.m., and then again from noon to 2, and then again from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. And this kind of erratic schedule makes it very difficult to sleep. And then depending on what their job is, it's either a lot of repetitive motions of putting on and taking off these tubes onto the teats of cows to pump out the milk, or it's work of shoveling and scraping cow manure and taking it to a manure lagoon on the site. It's pretty heavy, dangerous work.
And aside from the work, what are the living conditions like?
I think one of the most important things to know is that it's really isolating work. People live in rural communities, often on the farms where they work. So it's routine for farmers to provide housing to their workers. And there's very little, if any, regulation on that housing. So we've seen workers who have decent, mobile homes on the property, and we've seen houses on site with black mold in the bathroom ceilings, or, cockroaches, mice, ceilings that are caving in. When you live at work, you're living near your boss constantly, which is really hard to imagine. And part of the reason for that is that you can't drive legally if you're undocumented in Wisconsin. And so workers are essentially trapped at work.
How dependent or how important are these workers to the dairy industry in Wisconsin?
I've had so many farmers tell me that their businesses would collapse without immigrant dairy workers. Farmers won't tell you on the record that they knowingly hire people who are undocumented, but off the record they will. They have to. They say that they can't hire U.S.-born citizens to do this work. And again, the shifts are really intense, and the pay isn't much better than what you would get at McDonald's. So if you have a choice between shoveling cow manure all day or flipping burgers, you might choose the latter.
Is there a difference in the conditions, either the working conditions or living conditions, for immigrants who are in the country legally and immigrants who are in the country illegally?
So yes and no. So it's important to know that with dairy in particular, there's no guest worker program. There's no agricultural guest worker program that they're able to access, because dairy work is year-round, unlike seasonal crop labor. And so other kinds of agricultural work does often and increasingly rely on legal immigrant guest workers. Their conditions, it's hard to say whether it's significantly better, but there are some more regulations and standards for that category of work, and then the housing, et cetera. And we've interviewed easily 130, 140 workers over the past year and a half. All but 3 or 4 were undocumented immigrants.
I know you asked some of the people you talked to reach out to you using a messaging app and leave some messages about this. We've translated them into English. Let's listen to 2 of them.
¿Cómo fue mi experiencia trabajando en...
How was my experience working as an undocumented migrant in a dairy farm? The truth is, it has been one of the most difficult work experiences of my life. It wasn't because of the work itself, but because of the way my boss would address me, with insults and lack of respect. He would do this knowing that as undocumented, we always fear asking for help because of our migrant status. It was very difficult to work for this person. I believe that in all my working years, this has been the most difficult, and I hope that it doesn't happen again, because it really lowers your self-esteem.
Es bastante complicado.
The reality of being a migrant is very complicated, because the fact that we are in this country illegally, there are many things we have to be silent about. I think that the fear all migrants have is to be quiet, even if we for some reason decide to complain that some things are not right. Sometimes it can be about where we live or how bad the pay is, but we're still migrants, and it's best if we're quiet and don't complain.
How representative or how typical are these messages to what you heard in your reporting?
It's just extremely typical. A lot of workers feel that they're treated like less than human from their employers, but they can't really do anything about it because of their immigration status. It's really hard for people like that to speak up, to be willing to use their name. They're afraid of getting fired, getting evicted, getting deported, and they're just real and present fears for these folks.
Did you ask the farmers or the people who run these farms about these conditions, and what was their response?
Yeah, we talked to maybe a dozen or so farmers over the past year and a half, and it's hard. They're in a tight spot financially. They can't control the price of milk, and they don't always know what they're going to make. And a lot of farms, they go into bankruptcy each year. So they're not really required to do a whole lot. There's just not a lot of regulations for them. So a lot of them believe that they're doing the best they can for their workers. But when it comes to things like injuries, we've heard farmers kind of blame workers for their own problems, including their own deaths on the farm. And because there's little oversight, they're just not held accountable.
Melissa Sanchez of ProPublica, thanks very much for sharing your reporting with us.
Thank you for having me.
The complications resulting from the influx of migrants isn't limited to just big cities like New York and Chicago. PBS Wisconsin's Nathan Denzine went to a small city in southern Wisconsin to see the effects there.
It's another generation of families coming here trying to get jobs, feed their children, get their children through school.
Since 2022, around 800 to 1,000 migrants from Central and South America have come to Whitewater, Wisconsin.
putting a strain on local resources. Some of the most vulnerable in that population are children.
We're trying our best to really, how can we advocate for these children?
Miguel Aranda is a member of the Whitewater School Board and a second-generation immigrant from Mexico. With this new influx of students, Aranda says the school district needs more funding. Wisconsin currently sits on a $3 billion budget surplus.
I would understand if there's no money, we have to make our decisions. But to know that there's a surplus, it almost looks like the money is being dwindled right in front of our faces.
But there are people and organizations who have already stepped up to act as a stopgap for the new arrivals.
Our mission is to meet the needs of the community, whatever they are.
We know that they're here because if they've never been here before and they come in and see all these things and we tell them that they can just have it, they don't understand.
Christine Zabayos and Kay Robers are co-founders of the community space in Whitewater. Their mission is to provide everything a person might need, from bedding to furniture to food, all for free.
I've had the privilege of witnessing somebody coming in, maybe having their worst day, and coming in and just needing some support, some food, some whatever, and seeing them slowly relax and realize we're not going to ask them for any papers.
The community space has been accepting donations since 2019, but has ramped up its efforts in the last 2 years.
Well, I'd certainly like to say that there has been no crisis. Have we had to stretch and adjust? Absolutely.
They are open Tuesdays, Wednesday nights, and Saturdays as a complement to the local food pantry.
I can stand up in the middle of the room and say, is there anyone here that's bilingual? And inevitably, I'll get a 9-year-old child, which is awesome, and I always say to the child, isn't your mother proud of you? Tell her you did a really good job, and we're proud of you.
We like to think that half of what we do is what we share and give away, and half of what we do is how we make people feel.
Beyond food and shelter, migrants face a number of challenges when they first get here. Finding a job, speaking a new language, and driving are top of mind. Jorge Islas Martinez, an advocate and a first-generation immigrant from Mexico, says undocumented migrants are not allowed to obtain a driver's license in Wisconsin.
We don't have public transportation. The only transportation that we have is the taxi. The taxi only is available here in Whitewater from 7:30 in the morning until 5 o'clock.
I see it as a huge safety issue. I mean, if we're having people, especially driving snow for the first time, that is not a good situation.
Dan Meyer is the chief of police in Whitewater.
If somebody's able to come here and take all of the testing, the written test, physically do the driving test, so that they are safer as a driver, I'm all for that.
Nearly 20 states allow undocumented immigrants to obtain a driver's license.
I think the underlying theory here is that we know we need resources. For us in law enforcement, this is apolitical. We simply need more staffing.
Meyer says that over the last 2 years, his department's work has gotten much more difficult and time-consuming.
One of the things that has been difficult for us as law enforcement is just working with a population that, generally speaking, is not trusting of government because they come from a place where they don't trust their government.
To try and get some help for the city, Meyer and city officials sent a letter to state and federal officials in December.
We need more officers so that we can get out and patrol at the level that the community is used to having us out there.
But the letter requested more than just a boost in law enforcement funding.
This is a situation where we are a poor town that has limited resources and not enough shared revenue from the state, and we would like to help people make sure that they're getting jobs, shelter, food, all those things.
Brienne Brown is a member of the Whitewater Common Council.
The real problem is not that there are people here, it's just that the city is not prepared.
Meyer and Brown say they have heard from local officials who seem willing to help. In January, Senator Tammy Baldwin, a Democrat, wrote a letter to President Biden. She called for federal support for cities in Wisconsin, including Whitewater, to help with the influx of migrants. During a visit to Whitewater in November, Republican Senator Ron Johnson blamed what he called a flood of migrants on the Biden administration. Immigrant advocates worry the new arrivals will become political scapegoats. They want to see these new neighbors welcomed to their close community.
It's really contributing to the vitality in our community. It is where we see the future.
For PBS News Weekend, I'm Nathan Denzine in Whitewater, Wisconsin.
And that is PBS News Weekend for this Saturday. I'm John Yang. For all of my colleagues, thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by
Consumer Cellular. This is Sam. How may I help you? This is a podcast.
Are you looking for the latest news or to watch a show on demand? Follow us. Live international news is just a click away. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show in Mississippi, where 6 former law enforcement officers have been sentenced to between 10 and 40 years in prison each for raiding a home and torturing 2 black men. The officers, all of whom are white, belong to a group that described itself as the Goon Squad. In January of 2023, the 6 officers burst into a home, then beat, handcuffed, waterboarded, and tasered Michael Corey, Jenkins, and Eddie Terrell Parker. The officers also sexually abused them with an object while shouting racial slurs. One of the officers put a gun in Jenkins' mouth for a mock execution and pulled the trigger. The bullet lacerated his tongue, broke his jaw, exited through his neck. The officers then planted drugs at the scene in an attempt to cover up their act. The attack occurred in the majority white Rankin County, which is about 20 miles away from majority black Jackson, Mississippi. Some of the officers were also sentenced for their role in a separate assault just 2 weeks earlier, when another member of the Goon Squad repeatedly tased a man and put his genitals in his mouth. While the charges focused on these 2 cases, the New York Times and Mississippi Today have revealed that deputies in the Rankin County Sheriff's Department have for decades barged into homes, handcuffed people, tortured them for information or confessions. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a statement Thursday saying, quote, "The depravity of the crimes committed by these defendants cannot be overstated, and they will now spend between 10 and 40 years in prison for their heinous attack on citizens they had sworn to protect," AG Merrick Garland said. We go now to to Jackson, Mississippi, where we're joined by Eddie Parker, as well as his attorney Malik Shabazz, who is with Black Lawyers for Justice. Malik Shabazz, let's begin with you. Can you talk about the courtroom scene and the sentencing of these sheriff's deputies and police officers for what they did?
Good morning to the Democracy Now! Audience and Ms. Goodman. The scene inside of this courtroom in the United States District Court for the sentencing of the Goon Squad was absolutely incredible, and you wouldn't believe it if it was a movie. I mean, to see the big, bad, intimidating, murderous Goon Squad, to see all of them there, to see all of them in court, crying tears out of their eyes and begging the judge, begging Eddie and Michael, in this packed room was absolutely incredible. But it was well-deserved because so many other families and victims have had to shed those tears and go to jail for a long time behind their crimes and lies. I mean, Amy, it was absolutely incredible, and never have we seen this many police officers sentenced to this kind of time in 1 week, and it was awesome.
Malik Shabazz, talk about how this self-described Goon Squad operated.
Okay, well, they operate worse than criminals. I mean, they handcuff people. They like they did to Eddie. When they handcuff, they don't use warrants. They beat, they tase, they take their private parts out of their pants on another victim. They use dildos on Eddie and Michael. At least attempted to use them on Eddie and Michael. They waterboard like U.S. troops did in Iraq. They put guns to heads, guns in mouths. They shoot in mouths. I mean, they are everything that you have ever heard that police may do. They did. They throw down guns. They carry throw-down guns. They plant guns. They steal videotapes. And this is why they have received the longest and strongest sentences for any police brutality case in the history of the United States of America and even the world. This week, the 132 years given to the Goon Squad defendants represent the longest criminal sentences ever given out collectively and individually to police officers in the history of the United States of America. And they deserve every day and hour of it.
Eddie Terrell Parker, your feelings in the courtroom after having been so seriously brutalized and tortured to see these officers put away for years.
You know, it was a moment in history. I mean, it was satisfying. I enjoyed every second of seeing and watching it all, come to a reality.
I wanted to turn to Michael Jenkins' mother, Mary Jenkins, who earlier in the week spoke outside the federal courthouse in Jackson, Mississippi.
When I first found out that my son was shot and that he was shot in the mouth, I was almost certain that he was dead. I called Rankin County, and at first they wouldn't let me speak with anyone. They said they were in a meeting. And when I finally spoke with someone, I asked him if my son was alive. And he said, as far as I know. I said, when can I see him? He said, when we let you see him. This is a crying mother on the phone trying to inquire about her son. He said, Michael is our property. That's what that deputy told me on the phone. My son shot in the mouth, and he's telling me that Michael is their property.
That's Mary Jenkins, Michael Corey Jenkins' mother. Malik Shabazz, will Michael Corey Jenkins and Eddie Terrell Parker also civilly sue for not only personally these men, but clearly one of the things that their lawyers argued, the lawyers for the sheriff's deputies and the officers, is that there was this permissive atmosphere that allowed them to operate in this way. Will they be suing the state or the city?
No, we are suing Rankin County and its board of supervisors and Sheriff Brian Bailey, who was supposed to be running a department that supervised and monitored its officers. Unfortunately, during the sentencing hearings, it came out that Brett McAlpin, who is the chief investigative officer, which is similar to internal affairs, the criminals ran the department in Rankin. And that's why they are facing a very large civil judgment and civil trial in this case. This is a pattern and practice of the Rankin County Police Department to routinely ignore constitutional right violations. I want to say one thing, and then I want you to hear from Mississippi attorney Trent Walker. He's with me. He's from Rankin. But Eddie Terrell Parker gave the most powerful victims' testimony in these 3 days of sentencing these 6 defendants. He was very powerful. Mr. Mel Jenkins, Michael Jenkins' father, were very influential in these hearings. But I would like you to hear a further answer on your question from Mississippi attorney Trent Walker, who's from Rankin County. Here he is.
Good morning.
Hi, Trent Walker.
Hello.
If you could go ahead, if you could talk about the significance of what's happened, and does this open up hundreds of cases going back decades?
It should open up hundreds of cases going back decades. Anything that these 6 have touched, in point of fact, given the testimony that they themselves gave, and they used terms like there was a culture of violence. More than one of them said that, and that violence and brutality was expected for you to work on the night shift, which they did not refer to as the night shift. They talked about it as the Goon Squad shift. And so, yes, anything that they touch should go back, be re-examined, and really just as a matter of course overturned. Because when you find that they're willing to plant evidence and falsify reports, they had Michael Jenkins charged with aggravated assault on a police officer and with possession of drugs. Michael could have been sentenced to up to 38 years in prison. And as a criminal law practitioner in Rankin County, I can tell you, he would not have been slapped on the wrist, and he would have served many years in prison for those charges that they falsified and put on him.
I want to go to U.S. Attorney Darren Lamarck, speaking last year, announcing the federal charges against the former officers for the attack.
These defendants committed heinous acts of violence against handcuffed victims, whom they terrorized under color of law. As reflected in the information on sale today, these men sexually abused their victims, repeatedly tased them, tortured them, all under the authority of the badge, which they disgraced. But not only did they brazenly commit these acts, but after inflicting serious bodily injury by firing a shot through one of the victims' mouths, They left him lying in a pool of blood. Gathered on the porch of the house to discuss how to cover it up. What indifference. What disregard for life.
So I'm wondering if either Trent Walker or Malik Shabazz can talk about the state charges, also federal charges, what this means. We're talking about officers sentenced not only for the attack that we're describing today on Michael Corey Jenkins and Eddie Terrell Parker, but for 2 weeks before when they barged into someone's home. I think this was Dedmon. And how has he been described? The judge said he committed the most shocking, brutal, and cruel acts imaginable. Attorney Shabazz, you've described Dedmon as oppressive and sick. Talk about these acts that you know about that they did, that they were sentenced for in addition to the case of Michael and Eddie.
Well, about a month before, they had targeted a person named Adam Schmidt, and Adam Schmidt allegedly had offended Dedmon because he had allegedly stolen something from one of Dedmon's friends. So the Goon Squad gangsters, they had his tag and they had the tag tracers, and they had an order out. That if they found him driving anywhere without any probable cause to stop him, that they were going to stop him and deal with him. They found him one night. They called Dedmon, who came off duty, on duty, and then Dedmon, who was on this night shift. Now, I want to remind you that according to the sentencing hearings, you could not work the night shift in Rankin County Sheriff's Department without being a part of the Goon Squad. And overall, you could not rise or be promoted into the Rankin County Sheriff's Department without participating in violence and being violent at night with the Goon Squad. And every one of the defendants said that they were doing okay in their careers until they were inducted into this gang called the Goon Squad. Okay, so Dedmon himself, there's so much sickness here, but any officer who you see that will whip out his private parts and attempt to put it in the mouth of a defendant on the side of the road, take his gun out, shoot it by the side of his head to make him believe he's going to be killed, pull his pants down while handcuffed. This came out in court. Pulled the man's pants down while handcuffed, grabbed his genitals, told him how the size of his genitals, then dry humped him. I said that it came out in court that Dedmon dry humped the man after they took him to a private house in another jurisdiction. I mean, you wouldn't believe it if you saw it in a movie, but I'm imagining it'll be that one day. But you know, in Mississippi, I got to say this. We have a Department of Justice Civil Rights Division that is headed by a black woman, and Kristen Clark takes her job seriously. And her Southern Division attorneys have pursued and made history in this area. And Judge Thomas Lee, they thought that Judge Thomas Lee down here in Mississippi would not do justice, and how he has set a standard and put police officers on notice all over America that if you do the crime, you're going to do the time, just like anybody else.
Well, I just want to say, Eddie Terrell Parker, you and Michael Corey Jenkins, amazingly brave in coming forward and describing what happened to you, which seems to have broken open all of these investigations right now. I want to thank civil rights attorney Malik Shabazz and Trent Walker with Black Lawyers for Justice, and Eddie Parker, who was tortured by the Goon Squad. Thank you so much for joining us from Jackson, Mississippi. And that does it for our show. Very happy belated birthday to Tammy Warnoff. I'm Amy Goodman. Our website is democracynow.org. Thanks so much for joining us.
Donald Trump gave a rally this weekend in his race for the presidency in Ohio. He took to the stage and he talked about the EV push from Joe Biden. There's expected to be news this week where there's new regulations pushing the car industry further towards electrical vehicles. Part of that push, which doesn't seem to coordinate with any consumer demand, would have a devastating effect on the American auto industry, so says Donald Trump. And when he took that stage, he described the future. He described the auto industry and what it would look like under Joe Biden. Listen.
Let me tell you something to China. If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal. Those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. Now, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole, that's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it. But they're not going to sell those cars.
It'll be a bloodbath for the auto industry. It'll be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it. He's talking there about Chinese imports built in Mexico and the effect on the auto industry. I've had similar recent conversations with car dealerships and owners of car dealerships about the effect of the electrical vehicle push and what it would do to the auto industry. By the way, whether or not it's Chinese imports or the push for EVs, you are potentially looking at a bloodbath for the American auto industry. But that clip was clipped out of context. It has been splashed across the internet, starting on Sunday and bleeding into this morning on Monday. That clip has been turned into the following headlines. Take a look at this. From news sources from NBC to Rolling Stone. Trump says there will be a bloodbath if he loses the election. CBS News, in Ohio rally, Trump says there will be a bloodbath if he loses the election. Rolling Stone, Trump says there will be a bloodbath and elections will not happen if he loses in 2024. CNN, Trump warns of bloodbath for the auto industry and country if he loses the election. CNN at least putting in the context that it includes the auto industry. NPR, Trump says some migrants are not people and warns of bloodbath if he loses. Trump was referencing people like the murderer of Laken Riley, that they were monsters, not people, and he was talking about the auto industry when he was referencing a bloodbath. But the media immediately ran with this as though Trump was celebrating the potential and laying the groundwork for another January 6th, for political violence. That he was calling for a literal bloodbath if he loses the election. Here's a great example of what was taking place across the media, and as it merged with politics, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
He's even predicting a bloodbath. What does that mean? He's going to exact a bloodbath? There's something wrong here. How respectful I am of the American people and their goodness, but how much more do they have to see from him to understand that this isn't what our country is about?
Now this, at first blush, is insanity. It's insanity. How can someone be this stupid? How can someone be this willfully obtuse, in the words of Shawshank Redemption? How can someone be so mistaken? But first blush is incorrect, because this is not stupidity. It's not even insanity. It is purposeful manipulation. Yes, obviously, of a clip taken out of context, but purposeful manipulation of your mind. And the purposeful manipulation of your mind is to motivate you by fear to vote against Donald Trump. Now, I wanted to step back, as I always would like to do, and make sure that I don't straw man, but instead I steel man the argument for anyone who saw that clip and hears another January 6th. A steel man puts forth their best argument. What is it? How we can understand what they're trying to say? Is there inside of that some hidden kernel of truth? I don't intend to be Don Quixote, burning down, tilting my lance at windmills and burning down a field of straw man. I want to take down the best version of your opponent. The best I can tell is that Trump in that speech spoke, as he often does, stream of consciousness in a bit of a non sequitur. He's talking about the auto industry and said there'll be a bloodbath. And then he says that'll be the least of it. It'll be a bloodbath for our country. He is talking about, I believe, while one could say, whoa, he expanded it beyond the auto industry. He didn't limit it to the auto industry. He clearly said that'll be the least of it. He's talking about more than simply the auto industry. One could try to say, oh, he's talking about the country. And I would say to that, yes, he does expand upon the limitation of the auto industry. But I think it reads pretty clearly that he's talking about, A, the economy at large beyond the auto industry, and there would be a bloodbath, and B, the country at large, be it our culture, our economy, our inflation, our taxes, the loss of common sense, would be a bloodbath if he loses the election. I have a hard time steelmanning my way into understanding how they're saying he's asking for a bloodbath, that he's asking for insurrection, he's asking for January 6th, should he lose the election. I have a hard time understanding how they arrive at that phrase in that context, even with those non sequiturs, even with that stream of consciousness, is a call for political violence. Now, in steelmanning this argument, trying to understand it, and weighing against the potential that it's simply Trump derangement syndrome or willful manipulation of your mind, I have to take into account that most of the people hyperventilating and yelling about political violence are the very same people that sold me the lie about very fine people in the wake of Charlottesville, Virginia. There is a decent chance that some of you listening, and there is a greater than decent chance that anyone not listening to the Will Kane Show still today believes that Donald Trump called neo-Nazis very fine people. But in order for them to believe that, they can only exist and live in the emanations of words, the repetition of rumor. Throw a rock into a canyon and hear the echoes. They don't ever hear original source material, they hear the repetition of rumor. What did Trump say that day? And this one blows your mind when you revisit source footage. Trump said in the wake of Charlottesville that there were very fine people on both sides of that debate, talking about those that don't want to see our statues torn down. He then goes into, would you take down a statue of George Washington? In that case, remember, after Charlottesville, they were taking down statues of Robert E. Lee. He said George Washington was a slave owner. How about Thomas Jefferson? He says, how do you feel about Thomas Jefferson? In that moment, in 2017, he's actually, as is often the case, to be quite honest with Donald Trump, he's prescient. He's a fortune teller. He's looking into the future. Because here we sit today in 2024, some 7 years later, and of course they've attacked George Washington. Yes, they have gone after Thomas Jefferson. And he's asking, would you go after them? And he's recognizing there are very fine people on both sides of the debate about how to address revisiting our history, taking down statues. Then Trump says, very specifically, I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis. I'm not talking about white supremacists. Go back and look at the source, video from that time. Look at it. He specifically says, I am not talking about neo-Nazis. I am not talking about white supremacists. He says there's very fine people in the argument to take down the statues. And he says, but I'm not talking about the people in black. He's referencing Antifa. He's talking about the goodwill debate on both sides of this issue, how you deal with parts of our past that we've evolved morally beyond and rewriting our history. And he's accepting from that. He's complimenting both sides of the debate, calling them very fine people, and he's accepting from that Antifa and white supremacists and neo-Nazis. But that is turned into Trump calls Nazis very fine people. The opposite of what he said. How do they justify that to themselves? How do they get away with it? By clipping the very first 10 seconds. There's very fine people on both sides of this situation. Before he gets to the part where he says, I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis. I'm not talking about the white supremacists. This is what the media's become so adept at, and I know that I'm media. This is what the legacy media has become so adept at, and I know that I'm legacy media. But in the end, I'm Will Kane, and I'm going to do my best to share with you the truth. I'm going to be real and be honest. That's my pledge, to be authentic. To do my best to search for the truth and be honest about my biases. I don't get dictates down from on high. I'm not told what to say. How do they get away, the media, the legacy media, with that? By clipping things out of context. They have to be not stupid, not insane, at a minimum willfully obtuse, again in the words of Shawshank Redemption, or manipulating your mind. Zoom in to the very first few words, and then lie about the greater takeaway. Zoom in to his call for a bloodbath, and lie about the greater takeaway of the auto industry, the greater economy, perhaps even the country, by suggesting it's not a prediction for the state of the country, but a call for political violence. Now, how does this work into manipulating your mind? Here's how. Those headlines I read you earlier from across the media landscape, they're then echoed. If you do a Google search on Trump and bloodbath, you'll see how big tech plays a role. The top headlines, the entirety almost of the first page will be Trump calls for bloodbath in the wake of an election. Google represents 97% of the search market. If you want to see the truth, if you want to see full context, you have to dig, you have to work, you have to do things, like listen to the Will Kane Show. Now that tech is helping formulate the minds, a mass psychosis, a mass formation psychosis, politicians pounce. They use the opportunity. We saw from Nancy Pelosi. How about this from Hawaii, from a senator from Hawaii? He immediately told the media how to report this. He tweeted the following. Brian Schatz, headline writers, don't outsmart yourself. Just do. Quote, Trump promises bloodbath if he doesn't win election. That's a government official telling the media how to promote misinformation, how to write the headline. And by the way, how about an administration who has championed the fight against misinformation? They even looked to put in a board in to help, advance their goals of censorship, in advancing their goals of a mass formation psychosis, in advancing their goals of manipulating your mind. How does that work for the administration who's fought misinformation? Well, of course, to perpetuate misinformation. The Biden administration tweeted the following, the Biden campaign, and then Joe Biden himself this morning, Monday morning, tweeted, it's clear this guy wants another January 6th. He's referencing Donald Trump's speech from Ohio. He's taken the bloodbath and says, it's a call for political violence, it's a call for another January 6th. And then the money line. And then the poker player puts his cards on the table and says, I'm going to play my cards face up so that you can see. He then says, after saying it's clear this guy wants another January 6th, but the American people are going to give him another resounding electoral defeat in November.
Who killed Babai? Who killed Babai? Samadhanam Japamani.
Play the cards. Face up. Let them know exactly what you're doing. Lie. They don't care. To me, want the lie. The rest will be manipulated by headlines in Google. Lie. Bloodbath. Hoax. By the way, various Biden officials went on MSNBC and said, He's calling for a bloodbath. And in order to do that, they reference other hoaxes that they've already perpetuated. They talk about January 6th being an insurrection. They talk about January 6th being deadly. The only person that died as a result of that day on January 6th was one of the rioters, Ashley Babbitt. It was deadly only to one of the people involved in that riot. It's not, as the hoaxes perpetuated, law enforcement officers died on January 6th as a result of the actions of January 6th. Support your hoax with the evidence of other hoaxes. So play the cards face up, lie, perpetuate the hoax, instill fear, make you afraid. There'll be an insurrection. It's a move towards authoritarianism. It's the last election in America. We must save democracy. And then marshal your fear for your vote. Joe Biden says the American people will not allow him to do so and will give him a resounding defeat in November. That is the poker player's hand. That's the cards. Brazenly lie. Never let go of the hoax. Double down. Triple down. And that's what was done this morning on MSNBC on the show Morning Joe. Triple down. Listen.
He's talking about a bloodbath for America. It's laid out in the terms of it. And these idiots on Twitter, these idiots on cable news, these idiots on Sunday shows, our president, he was talking only about the auto industry, and this is one more. It's just bullshit. Let me say that at 6:15 a.m. It's just bullshit. He knew what he was doing. We're not stupid. Americans aren't stupid. He was talking about a bloodbath.
He was talking about a literal bloodbath, says the show of Trump derangement syndrome. But it's not. It's not simply mistaken. It's not simply insanity. It's not simply Trump derangement syndrome. It's willful. It's taking it out of context. It's been done before on dozens of occasions. It's being done now, and it will be done again. Get ready for the next 7 months. They're playing their cards face up, and all of it is designed to manipulate your mind so that they can manipulate your vote.
Tonight, several developing stories as we come on the air. Millions in the Northeast under threat from flooding rains and heavy snow. The outpouring of support for Britain's Princess Catherine as she's treated for cancer, and the death toll growing in the Moscow terror attack. First, that spring soaker. Several inches of rain falling in the Northeast. Philadelphia setting a new record for the wettest March day ever. At the peak of the storm today, more than 50 million Americans under flood alerts. And the new concern over high winds overnight, with snow blanketing several states. Our weather team timing it all out. Also tonight, well-wishers from all over the world expressing support for Catherine, the Princess of Wales, after she revealed she's being treated for cancer. The President and First Lady among those reaching out. And a very personal message from Harry and Meghan. New images of a man accused of sneaking onto a plane. They appear to show him snapping pictures of other passengers' tickets discovered after he exited one of the plane's restrooms. The Moscow terror attack, the death toll soaring. More than 130 killed at a concert hall. New video as Russian authorities arrest the suspected attackers. Survivors tell harrowing stories of gunmen who said nothing while methodically shooting people. The ISIS group claiming responsibility, and what U.S. intelligence may have known before the attack. President Biden signing a spending plan that tops $1 trillion. Final Senate approval coming after the deadline in the early morning hours. And why the House Speaker suddenly finds himself in the hot seat. New calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. The UN chief mandating a flood of aid into the region, and the growing rift between President Biden and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. The Mega Millions jackpot growing to more than $1 billion after 30 straight drawings without a winner. And America's Wrong Tonight, incredible video. Rescuers using blankets and hair dryers to revive a dog abandoned in sub-freezing conditions. The happy ending you have to see. From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight. Good evening. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday. I'm Wade Johnson. As we come on the air, millions in the Northeast are on alert for potentially dangerous flooding. One of the wettest March days on record. Some places getting as much as 4 inches of rain. Northern New England already with more than a foot of snow and more on the way overnight. The torrential downpours flooding roads in the New York area. Police closing some lanes as drivers tried to make their way through heavy floodwaters. Plows working overtime in upstate New York. Some places could get more than 2 feet of snow. And after the rain and snow comes the wind. Tonight, millions also in the path of powerful gusts reaching up to 50 miles per hour. Let's get right to ABC meteorologist Samara Theodore leading us off. And Samara, this storm could still do more damage overnight.
That's correct, Whit. As you stated, we are still under threat for significant flooding as the heavy rains persist. Take a look at these flood alerts. So we have a flood watch extending from Wilmington, Delaware to Boston, Massachusetts. Some cities like Philadelphia under flood warning saw their wettest March day on record. And it's not just rainfall. Heavy snowfall comes on the northern tier of the system. Parts of New Hampshire, Vermont, upstate New York have already seen over a foot of snow, and they could see an additional 1 to 2 feet of snow before it's all said and done, which we are anticipating this storm to wrap up just after midnight. Now, it pulls out and it takes with it the snow and the rain. However, on the back end, strong winds move in. A wind advisory in place. Wind gusts reach as high as 40 to 50 miles per hour. And even with winds growing calmer tomorrow, still pretty breezy start to the Sunday morning in the Northeast. Whit?
That storm still on the move, Samara. Thank you. We turn now to the outpouring of support for Britain's Princess Catherine, one day after revealing she was undergoing cancer treatment. Heartfelt messages from President Biden and the First Lady to Harry and Meghan. And tonight, Prince William and Princess Catherine saying they are enormously touched by the well-wishes from all around the world. ABC's Lama Hassan reporting tonight outside Buckingham Palace.
Tonight, after Catherine, Princess of Wales, delivered her deeply personal cancer diagnosis to the world,
my medical team therefore advised that I should undergo a course of preventative chemotherapy, and I'm now in the early stages of that treatment.
Support and sympathy flooding in. From California, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Harry and Meghan, releasing a statement saying, "We wish health and healing for Kate and the family and hope they are able to do so privately." ABC News learning that Harry and Meghan later reached out privately to Prince William and Princess Catherine. President Joe Biden posting on X saying, "Jill and I join millions around the world in praying for your full recovery, Princess Kate." First Lady Jill Biden also sending her own message, simply saying, "You are brave and we love you."
For everyone facing this disease, in whatever form, please do not lose faith or hope. You are not alone.
The princess's diagnosis announced just weeks after her father-in-law, King Charles, revealed his own. Catherine's emotional statement touching so many people who are now uniting behind the mother of three.
My favourite royal, so I was really sad to hear about it, actually. Yeah, so whatever treatment she needs, I really hope it works for her and she recovers well.
That's the overriding sentiment here right now, is this overwhelming feeling of affection, of concern, of people being genuinely really worried about her because they feel very connected to her.
There's a huge amount of sympathy and empathy for Princess Catherine as she tries to deal with this devastating news. And tonight, Princess Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, posting about Princess Catherine on X, simply saying, incredible strength and poise. Whit.
Lama Hassan for us tonight, thank you. And tonight we're also learning more about the shocking incident involving a Delta flight. Newly obtained video allegedly showing a man taking pictures of passengers' boarding passes at the gate. Officials say he then used one of those photos to board the plane. Here's ABC's Oreen Shaw.
Tonight, the shocking security camera footage appearing to show the lengths a Texas man allegedly went through to board a Delta flight without a ticket. Watch as the man prosecutors have identified as Wyclef Florizard, seen here in Salt Lake City's airport March 17th, appears to snap a photo with his phone of another passenger's boarding pass. He then looks down, appearing to review the image he just captured. According to the felony complaint, Florizard taking photos of multiple passengers' phones and/or boarding passes while they were not looking. And seen here, according to the complaint, using his phone as a boarding pass to get on the flight to Austin, Texas. Then entering multiple bathrooms on the plane. When Florizard exited one, a flight attendant noticed that there were no seats available on the plane and approached him to assist. This as the aircraft had pushed back from the gate and had begun to taxi to the runway. The plane returning to the gate, where Florizard was met by law enforcement officers.
I think the significance here is that what has been pretty much a foolproof system has a hole in it, and that we have to repair it.
According to the complaint, Florizard admitted he had made a mistake and was only trying to get home.
Zoreen Shaw joining us now. And Zoreen, what more are we learning tonight about that suspect?
Whit Florizard is facing a felony stowaway charge. He has been released from custody for now in order to undergo a mental health evaluation. Whit.
Zoreen, thank you. In Russia tonight, authorities are coming through the rubble for survivors in that deadly concert hall attack in Moscow. More than 130 people confirmed dead. Armed gunmen storming the building, shooting concertgoers, and setting off explosives. The terrorist group ISIS-K claiming responsibility, but the Kremlin today trying to draw a connection with no evidence to Ukraine. Here's ABC's Patrick Reevell.
Tonight, Russia saying it has now arrested the 4 gunmen in this horrific terror attack at the Moscow concert hall. Russian state TV airing these videos, which ABC News has not independently verified, claiming they show one of the alleged attackers being detained by the FSB. The man telling officers he carried out the attack for money. State media also airing this video, claiming to show another man accused of being an attacker bleeding badly. ABC News has not been able to verify the video. Video circulating online and verified by ABC News showing the attackers storming the packed concert venue. Panic as heavy gunfire sounds. Gunmen firing indiscriminately into the crowd. People struggling to get out in the corridors, bodies. The death toll now at 130, according to Russian authorities, who warn it could still rise further. ISIS-K, a regional branch of the Islamic terror group, today releasing a photo, it says, of the gunman, claiming credit for the attack, calling it the fiercest in years. The US also saying it shared intelligence to Russia weeks ago, suggesting ISIS was planning similar attacks. Russia has long been a target of ISIS. ISIS-K, the terror group's Central Asian offshoot, mostly based in Afghanistan. In 2022, bombing the Russian embassy there. Today, Muscovites lining up at blood donation centers. Others laying flowers in front of the still smoldering concert hall as workers continue to search for survivors. The attack now the deadliest to hit Moscow in 2 decades. One survivor, Anastasia, saying the attackers didn't speak, walking and firing at everyone they saw. My coat was covered in blood, she says. I think somebody shielded me with their body. Margarita and her husband also saying they were lucky to make it out. The gunshots went on and on, she says. Vladimir Putin in an address today promising retribution for the attack, but ignoring the ISIS claim. Putin saying the men were detained while trying to flee to Ukraine, and claiming a crossing had been organized for them there. Leading Kremlin figures today trying to suggest, without evidence, that Ukraine may bear some responsibility. Absolutely. Ukrainian officials have vehemently denied any involvement, accusing the Kremlin of trying to exploit the attack to fan support for its war there. ISIS has long sought to target Russia, in part because of Putin's intervention in Syria. The question many experts are now asking is whether Russian security services were so preoccupied by the war in Ukraine that they were able to allow this attack to happen.
Patrick Reevell, thank you. And the U.S. strongly condemning that attack in Moscow. And in an interview tonight with ABC's senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott, Vice President Kamala Harris pushing back on Kremlin claims that Ukraine was somehow involved.
Vladimir Putin is already trying to link this to Ukraine and say that Ukraine is responsible. Does the U.S. have any evidence to back that up?
No. And first, let me start by saying what has happened in an act of terrorism and the number of people who've been killed is obviously a tragedy, and we should all send our condolences to those families. No, there is no whatsoever any evidence. And in fact, what we know to be the case is that ISIS-K is actually, by all accounts, responsible for what happened.
And you can see more of Rachel's interview with Vice President Harris tomorrow morning on This Week. The Senate working into the early morning hours to keep the government running, passing a bipartisan $1.2 trillion spending bill. President Biden then signing it into law today. Let's bring in ABC's White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks. And Mary Alice, the president saying this deal represents a compromise.
Yeah, exactly. The president said, look, neither party got everything it wanted. But the bill, among other things, does include a raise for U.S. troops, new funding for Head Start. That was a White House priority, and money to hire 2,000 additional border agents. The White House also applauding that move, saying that it had been asking Congress for more funding to help secure the border. Now, some in the president's own party voting against it. Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, disagreeing with additional military aid being sent to Israel right now. And of course, we saw House Speaker Mike Johnson face blowback from some in his party for having struck a deal with Democrats at all. Now, as for a possible revolt from Republicans of any potential vote to maybe oust Johnson, the House is out for 2 weeks. So nothing soon. And of course, tempers could cool by then.
Something to watch closely in the coming weeks, Mary Alice. Thank you. Now to the Israel-Hamas war. Prime Minister Netanyahu vowing to press ahead with plans to invade Rafah, despite a personal appeal from Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And Blinken's mission to the region coming as the UN Secretary General makes an urgent plea for more aid into Gaza. ABC's Matt Gutman is in Tel Aviv tonight.
Tonight, the UN Secretary General having driven past miles of aid trucks waiting for entry into Gaza with that stark message.
Here from this crossing, we see the heartbreak and heartlessness of it all. A long line of blocked red relief trucks on one side of the gates. The long shadow of starvation on the others.
The UN acknowledging it has struggled to distribute aid once it's in Gaza due to Israeli red tape, lawlessness in Gaza, and bombed out roads. The Secretary General saying, we've seen enough, we've heard enough.
And Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered a similar message to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu Friday, ceasefire now. Echoing President Biden, the secretary also strenuously urging Israel not to invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah. But a short time after their meeting, Netanyahu announcing Israel will go into Gaza with or without U.S. support.
Secretary of State Blinken is in that SUV right there. These protesters have been blocking his entrance to his hotel, demanding that more attention be brought to the hostages.
Blinken eventually getting out, shaking hands with protesters. It came after a U.S. draft resolution in the United Nations Security Council for an immediate and sustained ceasefire tied to a hostage release was vetoed by China and Russia Friday. And amid the debate about Rafah, Israel now beginning the 7th day of its raid into Al-Shifa Hospital, Gaza's largest. Palestinian officials saying that scores have been killed. Israel saying it has detained over 800 suspected militants, and Israeli officials telling me it's their most successful campaign of the war so far.
Matt Gutman in Tel Aviv, thank you. Next tonight, amid the gang violence and escalating humanitarian crisis in Haiti, the U.S. State Department says it's monitoring the situation there, helping more than 230 Americans flee. Helicopters airlifting dozens to the Dominican Republic, others leading on chartered flights. The World Food Program estimates nearly 5 million people, about half the population, are facing acute food insecurity. There is still much more ahead on World News Tonight this Saturday. New concerns about measles in the U.S. with cases on the rise, plus millions in cash and 26 pounds of cocaine found hidden in the most unusual places. Next tonight, measles on the rise, with more cases already this year than in all of last year. 64 cases reported across 17 states, including one on New York's Long Island involving an unvaccinated child who was hospitalized. Chicago has reported 17 cases, and nearby in Indiana, health officials are investigating a possible mass exposure incident of measles at a local church. Health officials are urging people to stay up to date on their vaccinations. Heavy rain today has helped firefighters battle a series of wildfires in Virginia. The fires kicked up several days ago, fueled by dry conditions and gusty winds. Multiple trails were shut down in the Shenandoah National Park. Some schools were closed, and a handful of evacuations ordered. Authorities say there are no reports of any injuries. When we come back, expect a run on lottery tickets as the Mega Millions jackpot keeps on growing. To the index now in an unusual drug bust worth millions in New York City. Investigators say the suspect tried to hide money and drugs in trapdoors and furniture, including coffee tables, dressers, and nightstands. 26 pounds of cocaine and $3 million were seized from the Bronx apartment. The suspect, who faces multiple charges, is being held without bail. And nobody picked up all 6 numbers in the Friday night Mega Millions drawing, so the jackpot now for Tuesday's drawing will be an estimated $1.1 billion, the 5th highest in Mega Millions history. There have now been 30 consecutive drawings without a winner. By the way, the Powerball jackpot also growing up to $750 million for tonight's drawing. Good luck. When we come back, America Strong. Rescuers jump into action to give a suffering dog a second chance at a happy life. Finally tonight, America Strong, the incredible rescue on video and the lucky pup who captured the hearts of millions.
This pit bull mix named Horton is lucky to be alive. On a freezing day in January, the Kansas City Pet Project received an urgent call that an abandoned and unresponsive dog had been found.
We rushed an officer to the home, rushed him to our veterinary clinic. He was completely unconscious. Our veterinary team just immediately got to work to try to save his life.
Jumping into action, the team recording this incredible video, their delicate and methodical efforts to revive Horton.
So what they started to do was try to warm him up very slowly.
First using blankets, then hair dryers and massage.
And then over the course of, several hours, you just started to see those little signs.
Hope filling the room. 2-year-old Horton coming back to life.
His little tail started wagging, and he was just so happy to be around people. When we came in the next morning, he was standing on his own. After he was in our shelter for just a little bit, we decided to go ahead and post him on our TikTok.
That TikTok post eventually getting millions of views. Tracy Crippen was on a lunch break when she first saw the video.
The Casey Pet Project video popped up on my timeline, and it was so cute. I instantly fell in love with him. I started crying.
Tracy and Richie adopting Horton as soon as they possibly could.
He was the cutest little guy ever, and he immediately wanted nothing more than to start licking us.
Horton now in the warm embrace of his forever home.
Don't be afraid to adopt dogs. He had a rough start to his life. All they need is a little love and a little attention. We can be happier with Horton.
Absolutely. Truly a happy ending. Thanks so much for watching tonight. I'm Wade Johnson. Good night.
Thank you for making World News Tonight with David Muir, America's most watched newscast.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Woodman. Have a good life.